Well, thanks all for coming out on this crisp, blue, sunny day. We really appreciate the tenacity of your partnership. I welcome you all to the Bipartisan Policy Center. This is actually the second in our Bob and Elizabeth Dole series on leadership. And the idea behind these discussions is to call for real insights from national and local politicians, from educators, advocates, business leaders, to help us try to understand what are the kind of the characteristics and the circumstances that call forth great leaders. The question I have is, what is it that enables some people to rise above the aggression and debate that is inherent in any kind of free society and actually bring people together in common cause to try to solve problems? To address this and other questions, really delighted that we have David Gergen with us. As I think you all know, David's really one of the most foremost thinkers on this question of what leadership means. He is a professor of public service and the director of the Center of Public Leadership at the Kennedy School. If you ever turn on your television, you probably think of David as a dear and old friend because he has been a presence of fortitude and kind of coherence for many of us for a long time. He's also had the unique experience of advising 4 different presidents, which has allowed him to, I think, witness leadership and probably the absence thereof at some of the highest levels and most important moments the country has faced.
Let's not over-dramatize this. I started with Watergate and wound up with Whitewater.
Well, I draw people to the book you wrote, the Eyewitness to Power, Essence of Leadership, Nixon to Clinton, which was a nicer way to say what you just said. And as I kind of end up the drum roll of introduction, I think it's also important, David, that you've really spent a lot of your time focusing on the next generation of leaders. And we are delighted to have an intergenerational crowd here today because I think that's really one of the key questions. And so finally, I'll just say that we are really proud to have been able to name and affiliate the series in honor of the real extraordinary service that Elizabeth and Bob Dole have given to this country. As I hope you know, they are proud partisans. They have, over their long careers, found the courage and the creativity to dignify differences in ways that actually help make the country a better place. And so we are delighted to be doing this in their image. And with that, I'm going to have the chance to ask David questions for a little while and then put you all on notice that we intend to actually have time for audience interaction, which is one of the things we pride ourselves at BPC. And so I want to get it started with kind of a technical question. What the hell's going on?
Well, there's a saying now, if you're not confused, you don't know what's going on. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. First of all, Jason, I want to say what a privilege it is to be here for an event that honors Bob and Elizabeth Dole. I go back a long, long time with them, and I've worked with both of them, and I'm looking forward to talking more about them as we go, and remembering, among other things, Bob Dole's humor, which I think kept us all going, along with Alan Simpson and a few others. But I also want to say how fortunate you all are to have Olympia Snow here, have Dan Glickman here, and John Warner has joined us today. You should know the first and only time that I was a delegate at a political convention was in Virginia. I went as a delegate for John Warner, and it was there in Richmond, and when we had the vote and everything, and I believed then and felt really confirmed in my belief as later on. I thought the reason I supported him, I thought he was going to be so good at national security. I thought he would protect the interests of the country. He had served in World War II, he'd served in Korea, and he was deeply, deeply committed to the U.S. Navy as well as our other forces. So, John, it's good to see you had a wonderful Senate career, and we're honored to have you here.
I escaped and didn't get arrested.
That's good. That's good. So, what is going on? Listen, I think we're going through a passage in our time that is rather dark. And this is not to point blame at any one single individual or party. But I think that there have been forces that have been gathering strength and accelerating that I think have not only brought Washington into disrepute, we've lost the trust here in Washington, of so many Americans. And trust is so vital, I think, to the operation of a democracy. And if you don't have that, if it breaks, there was a time in the 50s and into the 60s, coming out of World War II, coming out of the Depression, when the federal government commanded the trust of about 80% of Americans. About 80% would say they believe the government would do the right thing. You know, President Eisenhower was in for 8 years, and Bob Dole has done a lot on the remembrance of Dwight Eisenhower. But Eisenhower was in for 8 years. His average approval rating over 8 years, 64%. Think of that. We have a hard time hitting 50 now. It's really been difficult for our last couple of presidents to hit 50. But those were good. Those were times when the Americans thought that, listen, FDR helped to pull us out of the Great Depression. Without him, we wouldn't have made it. And we went on, and he helped to win the war. And he had all these people around him. And then Truman came along, and Truman was unpopular for a long time. But he had sort of the wisest group of people in national security we've ever known, and they did extraordinary. They had extraordinary achievements during the Truman years. And then Eisenhower came along, and we didn't lose an inch of territory to the Soviets during those 8 years of Eisenhower. And we also didn't fire a gun. I mean, he kept the peace, and he kept it in an honorable way. So there was a sense for a long time that the government and the leadership of the country was strong. And what broke the back of that was a two-headed situation, and they overlapped in some ways, and that was Vietnam and Watergate. Those two events together were calamitous for trust in government. If you look back at some of the polls, we're running up at this high level, and then we just go off like a cliff. And we go down into the 20s, and it's been bumping along. We've never recovered, fully recovered. And there have been recent events which have also once again snapped that cord and severed the cord between Washington and the rest of the country, especially the Great Recession we've just gone through. We have not, psychologically, we have not yet fully recovered from that. It left so many people behind and anxious that we're now in a situation where I think not only is Washington stalemated, but the danger is growing, and it is really worth trying to explore these questions here about what are the conditions in which weaken democracy itself. We have always taken democracy for granted in this country, throughout my lifetime at least. We just assumed we had a great constitution, we had a set of traditions that, except for the Civil War period, had worked well. That we were the greatest nation and our democracy was a model for the world. And people came from all over the world to understand our democracy. But now there is this deepening sense that we're getting caught up in some of the same forces that are being felt around the world. And one of the most important trends in the world today is the turn of democratically elected countries under democratically elected leaders from democracy toward authoritarianism. And we're seeing that in country after country. Is prevalent in Europe, especially in Central Europe. You look at Hungary or Poland. You can see it now. Look at what's going on in Italy. Merkel is facing problems in Germany from the alt-right. The Brexit is obviously in our own hemisphere now, with Brazil on the edge. But if you also look at Venezuela, there are any number of countries you can point to. The Philippines, which is we work so hard to bring democracy to the Philippines. And of course, in China and Russia, you have two authoritarian countries that are becoming more dictatorial. And there's a number of books, there's been an explosion of books that are worth reading on this subject. The one that I have enjoyed the most is called How Democracies Die. It's written by two professors at Harvard named Levitsky and Ziblatt, whom I had never heard of before they wrote this book, but it's excellent, it's short, and it's accessible. It's not an academic jargon. And they make the point that since the end of the Cold War, 12 different countries, that number is growing, 12 different countries have gone from democracies to authoritarian states. And there's concern now that we see some of the same tendencies in our own country. We're not anywhere near as far down the road as other countries are on this, but there are signs we could get there. unless we pull ourselves together. And and that's not to say that Republicans ought to rule the country or Democrats, or it ought to be mixed. It is to say that unless we fix some of the things that are going on, unless we address them in a serious way, that the danger is something different than we've ever seen before in our lifetimes. And we ought to be very sensitive to what that is. And I think it is like almost a sacred obligation of people to go into public life today to protect our democracy, to nurture the democracy, and make sure that we have the liberal democratic world order doesn't crumble.
So let me ask you a little bit about
Sure.
the relationship between, Washington and the country, right? There's been denigrating our government while believing it's exceptional is kind of a national pastime.
Right.
I think, obviously, we've all been quite caught up in the turmoil of the last few weeks. But as I think about the Kavanaugh hearing, there were 5 or 6 senators who seemed like they were really not quite sure where they were going to land listening to the debate. And people thought that was really quite shockingly small. But that's about the percentage of the electorate that is really entirely open back and forth. I mean, there's, some people say it's, 6, some people say it's 8%, but the vast majority of the country seems to be just about as polarized as their elected officials. And I wonder how you think about the extent to which D.C. is basically kind of accelerating and amplifying the polarization. How much do you think this is just an expression of the public will?
Look, I think most important changes, most important movements in this country don't start in Washington. They come to Washington. They come rolling across the country. It used to be that you could predict the future by looking at California. Mm-hmm. And you could see the changes out there, and 5 years later they would hit the East Coast. So I don't think this is the source of a lot of our problems, but I do think our politicians are showing a cowardice by embracing these things, and it's a certain kind of irresponsibility to simply play on people's fears. That's the front page of, I don't know, the New York Times, I guess it is today, that both parties are coming down the home stretch on the midterms, playing upon fear. And that inevitably leads to, one side or the other may win, but there's not an agreed upon agenda, and you can't really say that there is there's a mandate for a particular kind of change. You only have a mandate for, we want the old bastards out and now bring in the new bastards.
So we spend a lot of time thinking about incentives, right? I mean, I think when people call on members of Congress to be courageous,
Right.
That's basically code for saying do something that's in the national interest that your constituents don't like.
Right. Well, look, I think there is a tradition, and let me speak to this, because I've been thinking a lot about Margaret Chase Smith over these last, couple, 3 or 4 or 5 weeks. Another time, another era, but at a time when Joe McCarthy was riding high and was very popular. It's hard to overstate that when demagogues have arisen in this country, if you look back over the history of demagogues, they tend to command about 35, 40% of the country. And that happened with McCarthy. It happened with it happened with George Wallace. It happened with Huey Long. It happened with Fowler Coughlin. They were all about around 35, 40%. They didn't break through. But in the Republican Party in the early 1950s, even Dwight Eisenhower was very, very leery of bucking the trend of Joe McCarthy. There was Eisenhower's most disappointing moment, what he always kicked himself on, was he was going out with George Marshall out to Wisconsin. And George Marshall was this luminous leader, one of my heroes in life. And he had a statement in his prepared remarks supporting McCarthy. And then his political advisors convinced him it would piss off McCarthy to go into his home state and say anything nice about Marshall. And Eisenhower struck that from his speech, and the reporters, of course, noticed. And it was always, I always look at it and call it one of the biggest mistakes of his life to withdraw that. So here was McCarthy, was a very large figure at that time. And Margaret Chase Smith, a Republican, went on the floor of the Senate and gave a speech called the Declaration of Conscience. And it is a wonderful speech, but she stood up to McCarthy, and at a time when few would. And that's what we mean by political courage. You don't see it very often, but when it comes, we ought to celebrate it as much as we can.
We also spend a lot of time thinking about relationships. Certainly one of my core views is that there's always been a lot of aggression in the democracy, but people used to know and like each other, and that enabled people to kind of metabolize that aggression and do things. And I think about the Jeff Flake, Chris Coons moment.
Yeah.
And I remember, I think it was Coons who said, well, we've traveled together.
Well,
we know each other.
That's right. I don't know. Dan can speak to this, but it's been my memory. I may be wrong about this. John Boehner and Danny Rostenkowski used to drive back to the Midwest together on weekends. A Republican and Democrat. They traveled together. Is that true?
Michael and Rostenkowski.
Bob Michael. I'm sorry, Bob Michael. Bob Michael, because they weren't that far apart when they got there, right? I mean, Rusty went on to Chicago. Yeah, but that was a remarkable relationship. And Coons and Flake do have a good friendship. I don't know how strong it is. I must tell you, I don't think they got what they were looking for. In terms of the spirit of what they were looking for was not what turned out to be the case. But you have to encourage more of those, and why the Flakes don't stay is a related question.
So I want to think a little bit about leadership in some other venues than just government. And one of the goals we have is to think about, are there examples outside of government that could be imported, and maybe talk a little bit about the media. I think there's a tendency to want the media to fix this.
Ain't going to happen. Media is a following organization. It's not a leading organization.
That is my experience as well. Do you think that the media has any obligations, conduct, aspirations? I mean, in the same way that you think politicians should be, in some ways, courageous against narrow interests, is there any reason to expect that the media does that? Or do you see ways in which new media is changing that may actually address some of the concerns?
Well, before we leave political leadership, I want to spend one more minute recommending to all of you, if you have time or you want a really terrific read, pick up Doris Kearns Goodwin's new book. It's on leadership. It's called Leadership. And as you know, she's written several popular books about presidents. And now she's stood back. She's taken four of the presidents, four of the boys in her club, as she says, and written a book comparing and contrasting their leadership and what one can learn. And it is one of the best books on leadership that I've ever seen. I'm about halfway through it. It's about a 400-page book. It is not a fast read, but it's an absorbing read. And she's got Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, and Lyndon Johnson. And she has interesting insights. If you're interested at all in leadership, political leadership, and I just think it's one of the best books we've seen out there. And fortunately, it's doing very well on the bestseller list. It was number 3 this last weekend. On the media, look, I don't know. I must tell you, I think we ought to be undergoing as much introspection as members of Congress and other branches of government should be doing right now. This has not been our finest hour or hours, and I don't know. I worry a lot that we are getting, in trying to assess what's going on, we're getting too hysterical at times, and we overstate and look for small things when there are other things happening in the country that you have to look at. I think you could just take every day for the last 3 or 4 weeks, the last several months actually. If you look at the cover, the front page of the New York Times every day and compare it to the front page of the Wall Street Journal every day, you feel like you're living in 2 different countries. It is like, one has got all the good news on the economy. It's every day new records. And then the other one's got maybe back, as Nixon used to say, back in the Garter ads, you can find stories in the Times about the economy. And if you look for stories about Mueller, on the other hand, or something about that, you got to go pretty deep into the journal. But on cable there is, and on, I think, television itself, I worry sometimes that we're getting, And look, I have a contract with CNN, and I believe CNN, by and large, has done a very good job. But even Jeff Zucker, the president of CNN, has said, and looking back, he has some questions about whether we covered too many rallies for Donald Trump in the primaries, and gave him an advantage. That's what the Bush people, Jeb's people, all believe that. And if you talk to Cruz's people and other Republican candidates, they all believe that that we gave him millions of dollars worth of free advertising. And even now, Fox is starting to tune back. I don't know if you've noticed that, but they're no longer carrying every one of his rallies. But there was a big question at CNN as well as at MSNBC and Fox, but especially at the first two, about the rallies during the primary season, because on one hand, it gave him free airtime. He always came on around 7 o'clock. He was very smart about it. And if you carried his rally, you got 14,000 people. If you carried Jeb Bush's rally, you went in the library. You know, it was just a huge difference. So you had a situation, well, wait a minute, this is news. It's phenomenal. It is a phenom that gets this kind of a crowd. That's a big story, so you're drawn to it. At the same time, everybody knew the more you cover that stuff, the bigger your audience, the bigger your ad revenues, the bigger your profits. And, you know, so what's right? I'm not sure I know the answer to that. What I do know is that we have to do a better job overall. This is true of all the media. Being careful not to look like a wolf pack going after the president. Yeah, my fear at the end of the day is if Trump were to go down, and it's seen that the press was a leading figure in bringing him down, along with the Democrats and the Academy and others. I just think it's going to be a terrible blow to the First Amendment and to the First Amendment protections we have. I think if half the country concludes that the press did him in, that they put the knife in, that is a very unhealthy place to be. And I've said that a couple of times, and I get hit on Twitter saying, don't be so naive. You've been doing it for months. You've been doing it for years. It's already happened. You can't start the clock now. So look, I think that all of which says that I think the press plays an extremely valuable role in the country as watchdogs. We don't have a parliamentary system where a prime minister is subjected to daily, questioning, at question time, and therefore has to be accountable to the country and to the voters on a regular basis. We don't have that, and we in this country basically substitute the press for that. And so I think it's right for the press to be watchdogs, but we have to be careful that we don't become snarling, all sorts of dogs you can think of. They're mean as hell, and are always biting at you. And there's a quality here we've got to get beyond. I don't think we know yet whether the Trump phenomenon and the clash we're having with the press and clashes over the truth, what's true and what constitutes truth. I don't know whether this is aberrational and it will stop when Trump eventually leaves office, or whether we are setting new norms. I don't think we can tell yet. And I think one of the big questions is, I don't care if it's a Republican or Democrat, but we do need to restore some of the traditions of the past. And one of them was a huge respect for truth. And when you get into a situation where it's Alice in Wonderland, I think it really does undermine people's faith in the institutions that you're trying to have lead the country.
So I have two more questions, which is advance notice for the rest of you. The first is thinking about the distinctions between leadership in public and private sectors. You'll often hear people say, government should run more like a business. To what extent do you see just meaningful distinctions? We now have a president who was a businessman, and there's a kind of a certain conceit of the business person bringing leadership to Washington. How do you see those two different spheres?
as a general proposition, I think there's much to be said for someone to have had a business background when going into politics. I think Mark Warner is a much better senator because of his business background. And you can point to others that have had to meet a payroll and know the responsibilities and also understand something about when there are excessive regulations that hold back growth. So all those things I think are valuable. I do think that if there's anything we should have learned, it is you're taking a big risk. You take somebody who's only been in business and move them, and have never had to, especially running a private business where you don't have a board and you don't have anybody you're answerable to. That is the requirements for governing and leadership in Washington, and the patience that's required, in the sense that you have to develop relationships to make the system work. They have to go across the aisles. You have to develop some friendships. There has to be true consultation. The Congress is a co-equal branch and should not be treated as sort of, this, we'll just, you're our staff in effect. You just carry out what we're doing. So I think we've learned that lesson. Trump has brought some other things, though, that, the economy's doing very well. Did he know some things that maybe the politicians didn't know about how to make an economy work? I think we have to be open to that conversation. I'm not a big Trump fan, but I also think that fair is fair. We ought to look at what he's done as a capitalist and see. I don't think we ought to make a judgment instantaneously. It ought to be a judgment made over time. By the time he runs for re-election, we'll have a much, much better sense than we do. We've just had the stock market's gone down 1,600 points in the last 2 days. What the hell's going on? We don't know. But you want to give us enough time before you can really make judgments on the policies themselves.
We blame former BPC senior fellow Jay Powell whenever things go south. So my last question is just a couple of your thoughts on future leadership. You're spending a lot of time now with younger folks who are obviously taking your classes because they're interested in this. Also, we talked a little bit about the wave of what would we expect to be women and more veterans coming into public service. What are your reflections on that?
Well, I'm enormously encouraged by the way women are responding and coming off the sidelines and getting into the arena. I think it's absolutely remarkable, and it could be the change we're looking for. That what we know in most fields is that when you get a large number of women and professionals within the field, that the ethics change, the conversation changes, the sensitivities change. For example, a number of people in this room will remember David Broder, who was this wonderful, wonderful columnist for the Washington Post and was sort of the senior member of the press corps, the most respected member of the press corps. And he always told me, look, when he first got into the press corps, there was way too much coziness between the press corps and the White House staff. If you go back, and they would set up each other for dates, and they basically had a rule that what happens outside Washington stays outside Washington. And it was a boys' club, and they fixed each other up, and there were women who were passing around and one thing and another. And then women came into the profession. Women arrived, and broke various barriers to come into Helen Thomases of the world. And it changed. It made the press corps grew up. They started acting like adults. And it was so I think that's a real possibility. The numbers that really I find just astonishing is that most of you know about Emily's List and why that's a place where women who want to run for office at any level can call Emily's List and say, hey, I'm going to like to get into this. I need help on raising money and figuring out staff and that sort of thing. In the last election cycle, back in 2016, there were about 1,000 women who called Emily's List to ask for help. So far in this election cycle, 40,000 women. 40,000 women have called. That's a revolution that's going on, and I think what you're going to find is a lot are going to be elected, and I think they could change the tone and tenor of how public life is conducted in this city. But I do want to say a special word about the veterans, and I'm glad you brought those up. I personally have, I believe for a long, long time that one of the major changes that has occurred in Washington that has accounted for the stalemates that we find and the partisanship that is so sharp is that a generation that was in charge here when I first came to Washington back in the early 70s was the World War II generation, has been succeeded by the baby boom generation. And I think their growing up experiences and what molded them as leaders are entirely different. I remain a huge fan of the World War II generation. I think they not only won the war, but they came back here after the war was over, and many of them hung up their uniform and started running for office. And it was a great wave of them that came in 1946. One of my final conversations shortly before he died was with Richard Nixon, and he, of all people, said that one of his proudest moments in political life was he had been elected in 1946. He was a freshman, and Harry Truman, Democrat, embattled at the time, proposed the Marshall Plan. It had 18% support when it started. It was really, people didn't want it. And then there was a bipartisan coalition that went to work to sell the Marshall Plan. Truman worked directly with, Republicans to do. Vandenberg was a huge person in this thing. At any event, the Marshall Plan eventually came to a vote in the House. And Nixon said one of the proudest things of his lifetime was that when the Marshall Plan was put to a vote, coming from a Democratic president to a Republican Congress, that he stood up as a Republican on one side of the aisle. And there, standing on the other side of the aisle, was another freshman, John F. Kennedy. And Nixon's point was, when the chips are down, we stand up together. And I believe that is what the spirit of the World War II generation was. I could go on for a long time about that. Well, the point about it is, at that time, in the early 70s, the number of people in Congress who were veterans hovered anywhere between 75 and 80%. And what that meant was that because people had fought under the same flag, because of Saltonstall wound up saluting some Polish kid from Brooklyn, that it democratized the country and gave people a sense of a common destiny. And I think that's the reason the World War II generation, to my way of thinking, was not a perfect generation. It brought us Vietnam, brought us Watergate, but nonetheless, if you look at the totality of their service, I think it was one of the finest generations we've ever had, and left us as a country. When they started leaving the stage, and Bob Dole was one of the last people on that stage, that when they started leaving the stage, the United States was the strongest nation in military power, economic power, sort of inspirational power, strongest nation since Rome. Since Rome, dominated the Western civilization. They left us a wonderful legacy, and we've been squandering it ever since. So there are a number of us, and I'm part of a much larger conversation, who believe that there are people coming up in the younger generation who remind me so much of the World War II generation. That the young people coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq, when they take off their uniforms, they have had an experience that very few Americans have had. And they have grown as leaders. They've been in leadership positions. They've assumed responsibility. And they have a very different spirit. It doesn't make a damn bit of difference whether you're working next to a redneck or some elite kid from Harvard. If you're out there on the front lines in a place like Afghanistan and Iraq, you've got to work together, and you got to learn to trust each other. And so there's an effort now to elect young veterans to Congress. And the guy who's done so much to push this forward is sitting right here among us. Ry Barcott, why don't you stand up for a second, Ry? Thanks. Let me just introduce. Ry started an organization called With Honor. I happen to be involved in. He was a student, and we've been friends for several years now. But it's a super PAC to raise money for veterans on both sides of the aisle. On both sides of the aisle. And you as a donor can say, look, I don't want to help these Republicans. I'm going to put my money on all my money goes to the Democrats. Or you can say, I want to put all my money on Republicans. You can mix it up. But they've endorsed people from both sides of the aisle. And they're doing remarkably well. They raised over $20 million so far, and they're heading toward 30. They got Jeff Bezos to come off. He's never given a political dime before, and he's in for 10. So there's a lot of effort here. And he's working closely with a woman named Emily Cherniak, who started an organization called New Politics, and she's fabulous. She's taking people who've either been in the military or have been out in the arena as social entrepreneurs, trying to bring progress on that side. And she's been working with some of these candidates. And a guy named Seth Moulton, who's a Democrat in Massachusetts, happens to be, Brian and I are very close to Seth and to Emily. He's organizing a group. Mike Gallagher is a Republican, as organizing people. And I'm really, really excited about what this could be, because if you could get Rye's view, and he's convinced me this is true, if you could build up a caucus of veterans who, with as many as 30 or 40 veterans in the House, you could be a swing vote. You could be an incredibly important swing vote if they would work together. There's already a group in Congress called Problem Solvers in the House that I think really needs a lift from where it is now. And so I'm very excited about this. And how many veterans are running, Ryan? Describe that just for a moment. So stand up one more time if you would. Yeah. Describe where the country is right now.
Thank you. And David, thanks for asking. And David has actually been involved with setting this up over the last 2 years as a co-founder of the organization as well, with other veterans, which we deeply appreciate. There were about 400 veterans that ran this cycle. It was about a 2x increase. This is just for the House. We're only focused on the House. And there are about 200 who are continuing into the general election. We've endorsed a total of 40 who have taken a pledge that is a character-based pledge where candidates say that they'll serve with integrity, civility, and courage, including the courage to be part of a cross-partisan coalition like this. And very pleased to have Senator Warner and others on our advisory board who are part of that great generation that set the stage, as David mentioned.
Yeah, Ryan himself, I first met him when he was had organized something out of Chapel Hill, Carolina, and Kibera, which Kibera is a huge slum in Kenya. And he has put a lot of his time into organizing that, and now has started with honor on the other side. So he's remarkable. Oh, by the way, and he is a veteran. He was a Marine and served overseas, came back. That's when a lot of things started happening. But thank you.
So that is a wonderful transition to some Q&A. So we have a couple of fleet-footed mic runners, and if anyone has a question.
So
Daniel?
David and I worked together.
Yes, we did.
I'm just curious about, Ryan just talked about civility and values.
Right.
And I look at the faith-based community in this country where, more people go to church, mosque, or synagogue than about any other place other than work. And do you see a void there? I mean, where are the leaders of the faith-based community in encouraging a value system which nurtures respect and tolerance?
I'm really glad you raised that. If you go back to some of the other movements that changed our national life, if you go back as recently as the Civil Rights Movement, there were a lot of preachers who were involved. There were a lot of people who came out of the faith-based organizations and made a huge difference. And of course, in the black community, the preachers were the people who held things together. They were the glue of many communities. And their voices are strangely quiet now. I don't know quite why. It's like there's sort of been a deal made quietly with the evangelicals. If you can deliver the courts, you can deliver enough justices, we'll stick with you, even though we may be horrified by your personal life and your personal mores. I basically find there are two narratives in the country now. One narrative is Donald Trump is the worst president we've ever had. He's the most obnoxious. You can fill in all the blanks. That's one narrative. Then the second narrative is, yeah, he's not a role model, is he? He's not a choir boy, that's for certain. That's for certain. But look at the results. And people say, look at the results, and I'm willing to forgive all the rest of it. And I think that's to some extent happening with evangelicals, because they're getting some of the results that are near and dear. but I don't think anybody's covered themselves with glory in our politics recently. I just don't. It's hard to be, you know, I'm inspired by some things like what Ryan is doing, but it's hard to be inspired by, to find inspiration now. Don't you think? I mean, who do you look to be the moral voice of the country? Well, that's a thin read.
We have another question right here. And introduce yourself, please.
Keming, a regular Bipartisan Center attendee. The Supreme Court will likely consider another affirmative action restriction with Harvard, I believe, as the defendant in the Asian American case.
I've heard a little bit about that, yes.
Yeah, and I just wondered, now with Kavanaugh added to the court, what is your assessment of what will be the outcome? How will that change Harvard's admission policy? Are Asians in your students in your classes? What are their thoughts, or what's the mood on campus, the Harvard campus?
The mood on campus has been much more directed into the questions about Kavanaugh, and especially about standards from the Me Too movement, and the backing and forthing about whether Mrs. Ford was treated fairly or not. There's widespread feeling on campus that's very much in her favor, and feels that finally women we're starting to get respect, and now they're attacking her, for bringing a hoax. And the president said the people who brought these allegations were evil. Use that phrase, we're evil. And that has set off a lot of alarm bells on college campuses. I must tell you, Kavanaugh was teaching in our law school on a part-time basis, and he was very popular. And he also he commanded the respect of a lot of women. And you have to take that into account. And John Manning, who is the dean of the law school, who is a center-right person, has been very careful not to go after Kavanaugh and not sort of join in the squabble. But I think there are people in the leadership of the university who are quite seized with the affirmative action case. But in terms of the students, I would say that it's a tertiary kind of concern. The leadership of the university, we have a new president, and a fellow named Larry Bacow. He had been president of Tufts. He'd been provost at MIT, first-class individual. He warned in his inaugural address, and this is a serious concern, about the assaults on higher education in the country. That is if there's anything going on, it is this broader question of whether somehow universities are in the gun sights of especially the far right. But it's been startling, because I happen to come from a school. My dad was a teacher. I come from a family of teachers. It's been my view for a long time that our crown jewels are our research universities, or among our crown jewels are our research universities. They're what distinguish us from China and a number of other countries that could be coming up our tailpipe. But we're staying ahead because of, I think, innovations in our DNA, but we also have these terrific research institutions like Stanford and Harvard, and you can go down. There's a long list. But that's, the recent survey found, in sharp contrast to surveys in the past, if you ask people, are our colleges and universities good for the country? About 40% of Republicans say they're bad for the country. Bad for the country. That is a huge twist. And then if you then sort of start translating that into policy, well, you've got these endowments sitting out there. Why don't we just tax your endowments? Well, they put on a tax that's going to cost Harvard $2,000 per student across the university by taxing the endowment. That puts the university in a situation where they may have to raise tuition in order to make this work, or we can't give out as much financial aid. So, go ahead.
I mean, could you specifically talk about
Affirmative action?
and the Asian students, Asian
Look,
students, particularly in your classes or on
We have,
campus?
I can't speak for every part of the university, but I will tell you, I'm in a school, Kennedy School of Government, and we have about 47% of our students are international. And most of those are Asians. And they bring a little, they're very, very good students, obviously. They're very disciplined. I don't see the evidence that Harvard is Harvard is discriminated against Asians. What I do see is evidence that we have earmarked more scholarships and more openings for diversity purposes. That you find that that the welcome sign is out now for African Americans, for Latinos, as well as for Asians, and we have a higher percentage of people coming in from that. And I would also tell you that we now have more scholarships for athletes. And under Title IX, you're not just talking about 5 or 6 teams, all guys. We now have 40 different teams that are NCAA teams, men and women. And each one of those teams gets like 3 or 4 or 5 fellowships or scholarships. So you start, and then you got legacies. And what you find over time is that if you want to bring in a more diverse class, you don't want to take it entirely out of your legacies, because guess what? They happen to be sort of some of the financial foundations of the university. So you need to be careful about that. And what universities have done, I was on the board at Yale, and I've been on the board at Duke. But in both cases, we wanted to increase the number of minorities, including Asians. But the only way we could do that without cutting into our, more traditional pool was to expand the size of the classes. And that's what we've done. So I think you'll find the number of Asians is actually increased. The raw number is increased. I don't think that I haven't experienced at all, and I have a personal friendship and enormous faith in Larry Bacow, who put out a very strong statement 2 or 3 days ago saying that Harvard is absolutely confident about its stance on this. And by the way, it's been supported by like 50 different elite universities across the country. There's not one university that's come out against Harvard on this. And
David, I think Senator
Yeah.
Warner wanted to jump in with
Please.
a question.
No. Finish that.
I'm finished. I don't think he is, but I'm
Let me say, as a spectator here quietly, we're very fortunate to have the benefit of your wisdom.
You're very kind.
Don't be too modest about it.
Yeah.
But you do have a marvelous conversational style with which to convey your thoughts with great sincerity.
Well, I learned from the World War II generation.
Well, I'll start with that. I was part of that generation.
Yes, you were.
And I only spent about 2 years in World War II training to go in when the war ended. But I want to talk about the senators that I see occasionally now and visit, and how their life has changed so dramatically. First and foremost, I spent 30 years there, and I enjoyed it. I had bad days, good days, but add up the good, they outweighed the bad. And I was able to raise a family and do the things that I enjoyed doing. At the same time, I felt I represented my state quite well, because they were going to reelect me for a 6th term when I thought I was in 82 that I don't want to be a Strom Thurmond. So I'm glad I made the decision. But I had lunch today with one of the leaders in our Republican caucus, just two old friends together. And he talked about his lifestyle. He said it has changed so dramatically. Start with the fact of raising money. He's constantly out there raising it for himself and his colleagues. My first campaign was less than $1 million. The projected campaign going on for the Senate now, $50 million is anticipated by both candidates, well, each, if they want to make it. And that's just astonishing to try and raise that type of money. Secondly, and this bothers me perhaps the most, we had good press secretaries. Usually they were likable fellows like yourself. And if you had to, you saw them once a day in the office. Is there anything I need to know? No, you don't need to go in. go on about your business. Today, these offices operate, the press secretary has automatic right to enter the senator's office and see you've got 3 minutes to reply to this email before it's all out. What do? They've got to instantaneously respond to all of this new media. And it just breaks up every bit of life they could possibly have. To try and be ready to respond in a minute's time or you've got a big problem on your hands.
Yeah.
So where do you think is the rescue in the case of raising that type of money and dealing with this eruption of power through the internet of personal communications?
Well, first of all, let me reverse that. I'm very sympathetic with the notion that we're swamped by the need and the felt need to respond to every Twitter, and every email, and to do it almost instantaneously. And I think I think people in the communications field just sort of that sort of article of faith with them. And I don't share that. I think that the public is not that sensitive today. I think the public is looking for results over time and not into whatever the latest tweet is, as long as it's not outrageous. That people ought to calm down. And my experience has been that if you get rushed by the press into making decisions, policy decisions are likely not to be very good. I remember, this goes back, and you'll remember this, but when Carter was president and the Russians went into Afghanistan, Stu Eisenstadt, who was there as Carter's chief political guy, policy guy, and a first-rate human being, as you know, said that they all felt they had to get a response and new policies out into the press before the evening news. And they had 6 hours. And he said almost every decision they made was wrong. Because they were responding, feeling threatened by the press or by the press reaction, as opposed to sort of thinking through and giving it 2 or 3 days. I think that most Americans are more adult-like than having to follow every Twitter, and I think that press offices should not be dominating. I think they're a valuable member of the team, don't get me wrong, but I do think you'll be, this will relate to you because you know him so well, but Henry Kissinger, he says that when he first started talking to senators, they would call him and said, "What should I think about this? And help me work it through." And he says now they call him and say, "What should I say? What should I say?" That's a real difference. And I do think that, there are 2 other things that I do believe are true, and that 2 of the things that have hurt our capacity to govern out of Washington. First was the discovery of air conditioning, which kept Congress here in the summer, and they used to go home. And it'd be better if they went home, and we had a little less frenzy here. But the second thing is the invention of really fast-flying jets, because it's made it too easy for everybody, and everybody feels under obligation now to go back home. And you have Bob Dole has complained about this, and I think he called it once ITT, in by Tuesday, out by Thursday. And that's made a difference in the relationships, don't you think? When I first came here, Kay Graham, would have a reception at her house. And you knew if you went there, you were going to find a lot of people that didn't look like you and didn't talk like you and didn't believe the same things you did. But you went, and people enjoyed it. Your kids went to the same schools. They played, baseball together. Or went to the same synagogues. And there were just neighborly relationships. I knew a lot of people sort of had houses here. And it made life a lot different. I don't see how you develop relationships of trust if you're only here 48 hours. And basically you talk to your press secretary and go over and vote and see if some constituents, and you make all these phone calls for money. It doesn't sound like a good way of life. And I often wonder whether we would get better people, more talented people, if we could change some of those mores. I think part of this is about changing the rules of Congress, but a lot of it is also changing this to traditions of that way we live with each other.
The number of members of the House who are sleeping in their offices,
Oh, it's
we
terrible.
find to be one of the yuckier aspects of the new dynamic. We have time for one or two more questions. Yes, sir?
Hello, well, Leon Peace. My question is, in the past you've said that, with respect to President Clinton, you mentioned that you found that he had no political north. I don't know if you remember that comment in terms of his political sense. With respect to this president, and his ability is uncomparable, ability to communicate with the voter out there, how would you characterize his political sense, and how do you think that might impact politics going forward?
His political sense?
Yes. Say, contrast to, say, to a Clinton.
I think he has a great instinct for power, not for politics. I think that's what he plays off of. He is interested, his bottom line is usually about how much power, how is it going to strengthen me? And he has a huge inner need, for reasons I don't to fully understand, to always appear powerful. And never, he does, when he considers you weak, he writes you off, basically. And I think it's one of the ways he, frankly, sees women as weak. And I think that accounts for some of his behavior toward women. But I don't think he understands politics in its true essence. And that is the capacity to build out from your position and bring other people with you, and to build up coalitions that can actually pass big things, hard things, not easy things. It's not hard to reduce taxes. What's hard to do is when you've got ballooning budget deficits, to bring them under control. What's hard to do is to figure out, how am I going to convince the country that we've got serious problems on the climate? And and I think Bob Dole would tell you that, and people who are here in this room would tell you that politics isn't about sort of just taking your 35-40% of the electorate and trying to bang the other side, everybody else over the head to get your way. That's about power. It's not about politics. And so you don't want to get me started, or at least too far down that road. But I think we're spending so much time worrying about him that we're spending enough time worried about how the rest of us should respond and should live out our lives, and what needs to be done to put the country on a better course. And we could spend all our time but it's like being on the internet and just being all your time on your electronics. At some point, you've got to get your head out of your internet and stop thinking about Trump and think about, what about the country and where are we going to go from here? I do want to add one thing before we leave. I don't think you can come together in a group and talk about Bob Dole and not talk about one of the real qualities he brought to politics, which I always loved, was he had a great sense of humor.
Fantastic.
And I think he and Alan Simpson were two of the funniest guys.
He still is.
I've met people in Wyoming. I met a woman in Wyoming once, and we started talking about the punchlines to Alan Simpson's jokes. And she would just come up with a punchline. We'd both start laughing. His jokes were so damn familiar to us. But Dole had a rapid wit. He could be so very sarcastic. But when I remember back I got a real chuckle when he ran in 1996 against Bill Clinton. He'd been warned and he'd asked Nixon, what are my chances? Nixon said, if it's a strong economy, you're going to lose. Otherwise, you can beat him. Well, it turned out to be a strong economy. So it was a pretty hopeless race, right from the beginning. But I thought he was a noble candidate in many, many ways. But he used to tell a story about going into New Hampshire looking for votes. And he went into a rest home. And as he went around shaking hands with people, he got a lot of blank stares. And he finally went up and talked to a woman in a wheelchair and said, do you know who I am? And she said, no, but if you ask at the front desk, maybe they can tell you.
That's a good one.
I was like, and the day he went into a gridiron dinner, I think it was gridiron, it was one of these fancy press dinners. And up on the dais were 3 former presidents. There was Jimmy Carter, and Jerry Ford, and Richard Nixon. And Dole's walking along, and he says, look up there. Hear no evil. See no evil. And evil. And Bob Dole loved Richard Nixon. You know, when he at the memorial service out in California, Dole gave one of the eulogies, and he had everybody crying. He was crying himself, but he never let anything get in the way of a good one-liner, and it always made his company. He was, you know, he could be caustic at times, but he loved his country. And I think to go back to the veterans thing, I think what he has done for veterans in his post-Senate years is nothing short of miraculous to marvelous. I mean, he's not only working on this Eisenhower Memorial, but he was a guy who really pushed and got the World War II Memorial done. That would not have happened.
He still goes out there and greets the honor flights. Yeah.
And he goes out, the honor flights that come in, you all know about those. On Saturdays, does he still do that?
He still does. Yeah.
Wow, 95 years old?
Yeah.
They're a remarkable group of people because, you know, Kissinger's, what, 94 now? Schultz, I think, is like 96, 97. I was just with Jim Baker, he's 88, coming out of that. And Jim just came back from salmon fishing up in the Arctic. He had to fly on a Russian helicopter for 2 hours to get, and Leon Panetta said, well, they build better helicopters, Jim, you know that. But it's, I come back to this generational issue is really important, you know, and I do think one of the things that's happening, one of the reasons I'm still very hopeful in the long term, I'm pretty pessimistic about the short term, but the long term is the quality of this younger generation is coming up. I'm just telling you, there are some wonderful, wonderful young people coming up, and a lot of them are going to be women, and there's going to be a lot more diversity, and they're going to bring, I think what we're seeing right now is a counter-revolution against a movement that's going to go forward. Counter-revolutions generally die out over time. It's the revolution itself, and the revolution is on the side of social justice. And I think we're going to be encouraged, at least I hope we are. But people have got to get in the arena. They got to help these young people. They got to get out there themselves, getting into the arena, voting, but staying in the arena, not just for the vote, but staying in there for the building of a new democracy is really important. But I appreciate being here.
Well, David, I was going to ask you what made you optimistic, and you just answered it. So,
Okay, good.
I think we all appreciate your service in the arena, and glad that you're aspiring to be at it till you're in your mid-90s as well. So we think that that's an appropriate bar that you've set. But thank you for joining us, and really appreciate
Thank you
everybody being here.
very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks very much. Good.